semiotics in Latin America, you can also prepare those questions, and we can talk about them at the end of Jorge's talk. So without any further ado, I leave you with Jorge, and yes, so thank you.
Okay, so I hope everyone hears me well and sees me well now. Thanks to Israel for introducing me, and thanks to everyone at Semiosalong for inviting me. Thanks to the people who is joining us online in this last session of Semiosalong. So, yes, like he said, I'm Jorge Luis Flores. I studied in Tartu University. I finished my master's a year ago. And so I also want to just a little disclaimer before starting with my presentation. I have been sort of away from the material for a year since my final defense of the thesis. So please go gentle on me if I don't remember some things properly. And obviously, if people have questions and for some reason I'm unable to respond, I would like to invite the people who are here with me or in the chat to fill in if they know or they have a better answer than I have. So now I'm gonna try and share my screen. Let's hope that nothing goes wrong in that. Can you see my screen now? Yes, I think.
No.
No? Okay. Can you see my screen now?
It's loading. There, now it's coming in.
Okay. So, well, yes, the title of my presentation for tonight is Bachelor Machines, an intertextual reading of 2666. So a little bit of context to begin with. 2666 is a novel written by Roberto Bolaño. Roberto Bolaño was a Chilean author. He was born in Chile in 1953. He died in Spain in 2003. And 2666 was his last novel, at least the last one he actually intended to get published. I have it here with me. I have it both in Spanish. Oh, you cannot see it because I'm sharing my screen. I will show it to you. Oh, okay. So here is the novel in Spanish. Here is all my notes, and here is the novel in English. Here are all my notes. So most critics consider 2666 Bolaño's masterpiece, really the culmination of his work, the point where all his obsessions and his ambition during his career came to like a culmination. Well, like you saw in the image, it's a monster of a novel. It sprawls over 1,000 pages in its original Spanish, over 900 in its English translation, and it's really a challenge for the reader, not only because of the length of the work, but also because of its disjointed nature. The novel is divided into 5 chapters. Each chapter can really be read as a novel unto itself, and they are only connected tangentially. One of the surprises, let's say, for the reader as you go along is that you expect a clearer thread to go through it, because the novel poses 2 main questions in the first chapter for the reader, both questions are related to the notion of authorship, but in very different ways. So one question is, who is the writer Veno von Arcimboldi, who is a character in the novel? And another question is, who is the killer, the serial killer behind the horrifying murders of females in the city of Santa Teresa in the northern border in Mexico? And the problem arises when you go through the chapters and you realize that there's barely any overlap in between them. Really, they are very independent. They tell very different stories. Very few characters appear in more than one chapter, and when they do, it's usually as a very minor character. I'm going to go to the next slide. What this poses for the reader, it's really a challenge. So why is this huge novel divided into 5 smaller novels that are very disconnected? Why does it deserve to really be one single text? And if it is, then how can you discover it? Because the novel doesn't offer any final answer. It doesn't have anything close to what we normally consider a narrative closure. It really leaves you with more questions than you had before starting it. And so what I'm proposing here, the reason I thought it was an interesting case for a semiotics analysis and approach, is because I thought it demanded not only a traditional interpretation or a traditional exegesis, but rather also the development or the finding of a reading strategy. So I have here a couple of homemade visual examples of what I am trying to propose. I hope that they load. I hope you can see them. So these are pages from the novel, obviously, and the little red dot symbolizes a linear reading, the normal reading of the book. So you do that, and at the end you're left either frustrated or amazed by the book, but just baffled. And so what if instead we did an alternative reading that not literally jumps from one to another, like in something like Rayuela or Hopscotch from Julio Cortázar, but rather just out of that linear reading, go into a really deep, a close reading, and trying to find sort of clues spread across the whole text to see how, where are the threads that really bind it together. And so what I propose is an intertextual reading of the novel. And here is where things get a little bit more complicated, because it's not only so first of all, how can it be an intertextual reading of one single novel? Wouldn't that be intratextual? So if we're relating passages from the same book with the same book, it would technically be intratextual. However, as I established before, the book can be read as separate books in a cycle. But also, and those who are familiar with Bolaño, who have read his work, his narrative work, know that one of his techniques is indulging in digressions. So he's telling you a story, but then he goes into another story, and this can be sometimes as Chinese boxes, like a story within a story, but sometimes they're just truly a branching out of the first story, and most of the time they don't have a proper end. It's not clear how they're related to the story. And it has been proposed, for example, by let me look for his. I forgot his first name, but well, Fava is one of the many people who have studied the work of Bolaño. He has proposed, for example, that 2666 is not only a collection of novels, but also a collection, it can be read as a collection of short stories, given the vast amount of disconnected subplots that are kind of closed narratives unto themselves. 246 subchapters or subplots were identified during my reading of the book. Yes, and so there's that first layer of intertextual reading when the book and all its relationships to itself, to its tinier books, let's say. But then there's also the intertextual connections that the book offers to other texts. Bolaño is a very bookish author, so he makes references to tons of other authors. Sometimes these references are explicit, and sometimes these references are implicit, but very marked or very obvious. Like, for example, there's a part in the book that tells a story of how to say, like a bureaucrat, a Nazi bureaucrat in a small town in Poland, and he's in charge of getting rid of 500 Jewish prisoners. And this whole small subplot reads very much like Kafka. It has a very Kafkaesque tone and style to it. So, okay, there's that relationship to other texts that are not limited to books. It's also paintings and to his own texts, because Bolaño also, he said once that his ideal reader was a reader who would embark upon the reading of his whole oeuvre, because he says that all his books relate to each other. Characters reappear here and there, places reappear here and there. So we have another layer. And finally, the last layer that I want to add to this is contextual reality. So for those of you who don't know, who haven't read the book or don't know what it is about, 2666 it's about a ton of things, but one of the main things, one of the few common threads to all the stories is the horrible cases of mass femicide in a city in the northern border of Mexico. In the book, it's called Santa Teresa. It's a fictionalized city, but it's obviously based on Ciudad Juárez. Bolaño investigated, or he did a lot of research on these murders. He even developed a professional relationship and later a friendship with Sergio González Rodriguez, a journalist who worked a lot on the investigation of these murders. And so I won't be able to go into detail, but if you want to go into detail, you can ask me for my thesis and and indulge. But his fictionalization of the murders is extremely close to what happened in real life. And so obviously he's implicating a reality or extra-textual reality. And so a reading of the novel won't be complete without the involvement of all these layers. Okay, I hope I haven't lost anyone until here. So when I talk about intertextuality, I don't mean intertextuality in the, let's say, watered down, more naive notion of intertextuality that has become more popular, which is merely the referencing of other texts in a text. So I don't know, it's not Easter eggs in a Marvel movie, for example. When I talk about intertextuality, I refer mainly to the notion as managed or as expressed by Julia Kristeva, who coined the term. Jorge Kristeva is a philosopher and semiotician from the Tel Quel group in France, and she first spoke of intertextuality, developing the concept on top of the notion of dialogism in I forgot his name right now, Mikhail Bakhtin. And so what she said is each word or text is an intersection of words or texts where at least one other word or text can be read. Any text is constructed as a mosaic of quotations. Any text is the absorption and transformation of another. So what is important to take from here, from her, is that intertextuality is always an unstable relationship between texts that generates more meaning than the one that is contained if you read it without this interplay. And this intertextuality in itself, when properly used, is transgressive. That's the main point for Kristeva. But since we're in Tartu, I also want to call to one of the main semiotician from Tartu, Yuri Lotman, and he also spoke in the structure of the text about intertextuality, albeit in a different way, without actually saying that word. He said, heterogeneous elements are combined in such a way as to create, on the one hand, definite perceptible structural sequences, and on the other hand, the continual violation of those sequences as a result of the imposition of other structures on their disruptive influence, This leads to the creation of an extremely flexible mechanism with incalculable semantic energy. So this might sound very obscure to some of the people in the audience, but basically is the same as Kristeva was saying. The interplay of texts is almost like we could think of something as a chemical reaction. So a chemical reaction is always violent, but it always generates something new. In this case, it generates meaning. Now, this is kind of a quick, a quick explanation to why I do this, because some people might say, okay, you're jumping too much. You're saying that one book is a ton of books, but at the same time, you want to bring other texts from outside and you want to bring reality into it. So what is the boundary? What is the Okay, sorry everyone. I'm famous for my. I might be a gremlin. I bring about technical problems in every presentation I have, every single time. I hope it doesn't happen again. Okay, so in short, why am I including all of these things? Why am I changing and shifting the frame? Is it everything okay? Okay. It's because it's also part of the poetics of the book. And here I bring Lotman again. He said, in likening itself to the cultural macrocosm, on the one hand, becomes more significant than itself alone and acquires the features of a cultural model, speaking in this case about this text. Okay, so what is my semiotic intertextual reading of 2666? There are 4 themes guiding the reading. We're only going to talk about 3 that I consider the most important: the Black Sun, Sacrifice and Progress, Phallococentrism, Misogyny and Machismo, and the Hidden Center, the Bachelor Machines. So first, this is going to be the longest because since we're talking about Latin America, this is the one that has to do the most with Latin America. The Black Sun, Progress and Sacrifice. So one of the things that might jump to the reader, that might be a little bit jarring, is that there are many mentionings of Aztecs, and at first it might seem normal, but one of the ones that is the most jarring happens in the part about Archimboldi, the last chapter in the book. This chapter occurs in Germany, and this moment in the book occurs before the start of the Second World War. So our main character to him is she starts speaking about the Aztecs. She's speaking about how she imagines the lakes in the land where the Aztecs live. She said, much prettier than in Switzerland, with no mosquitoes, nice weather all year round, lots of pyramids, so many and so big it's impossible to count them. Pyramids behind other pyramids, all stained red with the blood of daily sacrifices. And so this might sound weird coming from a 16-year-old German girl in the 40s, but precisely because it's weird, it jumps out of the page, and you start relating it to other occurrences of Aztec mentionings in the book. And so, why is this important? Why is this relevant? So here we have an image from the Codex that speaks about the legend of the fifth sun. The legend of the fifth sun is a foundational myth for the Aztec people. So what happened very shortly is the original myth stopped in the fourth, after the fourth sun, but the Aztecs needed a foundational myth for themselves, so they developed the necessity of creating a new sun for their age. And so the gods united. One of them had to immolate himself, burn alive, and he became the sun. In some readings, he's Huitzilopochtli. And then, in order for him to actually get on the sky, other gods had to sacrifice. Huitzilopochtli also killed Coyolxauhqui and her daughters, the stars, and that created the moon and the stars. And so this battle, this bloody battle, the Aztecs believed, had to be reenacted every day. And so Huitzilopochtli needed energy to do it all again, otherwise night would be eternal. So he required human sacrifice. So there's an interesting exchange here, because the importance of this foundational myth for the Aztecs is that it was also a tool to explain themselves and to explain to others why they were destined to be the ruling power in Mesoamerica. So they were the people chosen by the sun. And so that's why human sacrifice was central to them. And so we see a relationship, an exchange. You need sacrifice in order to attain power, progress. So here's another occurrence in the novel, this time in the part about the crimes. One of the victims, María de la Luz Romero, 14 years old, had just begun working at the Maquiladora EMSA, a factory that was like a melon-colored pyramid, its sacrificial altar hidden behind smokestacks. And so now we see a and so I'm going to try to be very brief here, just to explain kind of the history of how this came to happen. According to the UN and several others, the FMI, the World Bank, the main way, what? IMF, sorry. the main way to attain or to improve, to reduce poverty, to improve quality of life in countries is to achieve sustainable development. And by that, really what it means is economic growth. And so Mexico, during many decades after the revolution, they had a system that was kind of an embedded liberalism, but it was very protected so the state had a lot of power. There was only up till the 50s, there was only 8% of foreign investment in Mexico. But this changed because starting in the 60s and then especially the 70s, the situation began to change. Mexico was doing good. We even talked about the Milagro Mexicano, the Mexican miracle in the 50s. But then, due to several things I won't bring out unless someone asks, the economy began to decline. And in 76, there was a huge crisis. Then in 88, there was another huge crisis. Mexico couldn't pay its foreign debt that had escalated up to $90 billion. And so it went into default. How was it saved from this? Was that the IMF and the government of the United States, back then it was Reagan, they decided to roll out Mexico's debt in exchange of Mexico implementing a set of structural reforms. And these structural reforms that began to be implemented in the end of the 80s led to the installment, among other things, of maquiladoras in a northern border. So areas where foreign investment was accepted, where very cheap labor could be acquired, and among other things. This culminated with NAFTA, the national. Yes, the free trade agreement, national American, yes. in 1994. And so did it deliver? Because what it promised is that there would be now sustained economic growth. If we see only the case of Ciudad Juárez, it appeared to do so because there was a huge growth in the middle class. It was Ciudad Juárez was the city that had the lowest unemployment level, and Bolaño mirrors this in his rendering in Santa Teresa, because here we have an excerpt from the book. It's a dialogue, so there's a character who is a journalist is asking a person who works for the government, and this person is telling him, like, this is the city that has the lowest female unemployment rate, and she does say it's badly paid and exploitative work with ridiculous hours and no union protections, but work after all. However, there's a dark side, or a dark underbelly, a contrast between this phase of progress and progress, and also like the ugly side of this progress. So, for example, according to research, both the middle and upper classes grew, and Ciudad Juárez was the Mexican city with the highest number of cars and mobile phones, for example, in the 90s. But also 50% of the working population still lived with 2 minimum wages or less. 40% of Juárez's inhabitants lived in extreme poverty. And also the population in one decade grew 52%, mostly from immigration from Central America and the southern states in Mexico, which have always been poorer. And so infrastructure couldn't keep up with this level of population growth. And this led to huge areas of the city becoming slums that didn't have access to basic needs being covered. So some of the characteristics of neoliberal reform being implemented in third world countries implies, well, in every country, implies that several structural changes that include mostly the state spends less in public well-being. So this also leads to the disruption of the social tissue. There in Ciudad Juárez, for example, the population growth and most mothers and fathers working led to a huge surge in children, mostly growing up alone. And this also led to a 40% increase in gangs, in the number of gangs in the city. So just to name a few examples. So to the matter at hand of the femicides. In the novel, Chucho Flores, a police officer, tells a journalist that's coming from the US about the victims of murder in Santa Teresa. And he says, most of them are workers at the maquiladoras. This is actually also true, according to investigations. We can't say for sure because a huge number of the bodies were never identified. And so this led a researcher, Melissa W. Wright, to, thank you very much, develop a concept which she called the myth of the disposable third world woman. She did this research in offshore factories, both in Ciudad Juárez in Mexico and in China. And the case of Ciudad Juárez really impacted her. And so she posits that the third world woman is that who generates widespread prosperity through her own destruction. She linked femicides with the exploitation at these factories. She says, women are determined to be worthless, or when women corpses are dumped like trash in the desert. These discourses explain how, given these women's intrinsic worthlessness, such events are both natural and unavoidable. So she observed this because one of the characteristics of work in these places, employment in these places, was a huge rate of turnover. So most people wouldn't last longer than 6 months in a job, and they would go and work in another job, or they would fall into poverty and have to recur to illegal activities. And so she says that this is actually not like an incidental downside, but this is a crucial part of how these factories work and how they generate wealth. So because they observed that after a certain period of time, these women would start complaining, would start demanding better pay, would start demanding more rights, would try to form unions. And so the role of the managers was basically to try to find the perfect rate at which to hire and fire women. And she links the way this, the way the worth of these women is depleted in the factory to the way it is also depleted in society. So we also have other references across the book of sacrificial victims. For example, there is a moment where Fate, one of the characters in the third part of the novel, he is having dinner and he overhears a conversation in which an older man is explaining a younger man why these murders are not really a big deal or are not taken as a big deal by society at large. And he's explaining how across history there have always been people who are worth less, and so their violence inflicted upon them is not even necessarily worth of mentioning. He brings up the example of, in the 17th century, for example, at least 20% of the merchandise on every slave ship died. And so obviously, what is the merchandise on a slave ship is people. But on the other hand, and he says this, if the daughter of a plantation owner was raped and murdered, this would be news that would even create like a legend in the town of the rapist and murderer, and would continue to be spoken about for years. I'm not going to read all of this because you have it on your screen. You can see in the quotation, in the final marks, how they come from very distant fragments of the book, and these are only some that I selected. There's many more. So finally, to conclude this part, so in the first two pictures we have here, we have Friedman and Hayek, two of the forefathers, the architects, let's say, the intellectual architects of neoliberalism, as it came to be known. And Friedman said, history suggests only that capitalism is a necessary condition for political freedom. And Hayek wrote, many who think themselves infinitely superior to the aberrations of Nazism and sincerely hate all its manifestations work at the same time for ideals whose realization would lead straight to the abhorred tyranny. So they said this in Friedman in The Road to Serfdom, his most influential book, and Hayek in Capitalism and Freedom. They were proponents of capitalism as the ideal way of preventing anything as horrible as the Second World War or the rule of Stalinist Russia from ever happening again. However, and this is not to say that they themselves are to blame necessarily, but more that how their ideas were played out in reality. The place where neoliberalism was tried out first was in Chile, as many of you might know. I also won't go into details here. If someone wants to ask afterwards, I can try and explain. But well, with the Chicago boys, who were economists that were offered great scholarships to go and study in the best universities in the US, they were formed in these ideals, then sent back to Chile to kind of affect them. And the coup that was effected against the government of Allende, who was backed by the United States, Pinochet came to power in Chile. And this was all to try out neoliberalism first outside of the United States or of the UK. There's a very, how much time I have been speaking? Should I? Okay. So there is actually a connection between Nazi Germany and the Pinochet rule in Chile that is not only like a metaphorical connection. I'm bringing up the Nazi Germany because that's a huge part of 2666 in the last chapter. So after World War II ended, we all know that many important high-ranking Nazi officials went into South America, where many of them could finish their lives. But also, over 1,000 Nazi officials were given, what's the word, refuge or asylum, or the Soviet Union and the threat of communism, these people who were formerly their enemies had become suddenly a very valuable asset because they had information that the CIA and FBI didn't have on the Soviet Union. And then later, DINA, the secret police that was used by Pinochet to quelch revolutionaries, it was trained by the CIA. This is also treated in other books by Bolaño. For example, in Chile by Night, there's a part of the book where people are invited into a soiree with the creme de la creme of the intellectuals and artists in Chile. And while they are having dinner, one of them gets lost looking for the bathroom, and he ends up in a torture chamber that was used by the husband of the poet who was inviting them, the hostess. And this is based on a true story as well. So we see that there's actually a link, and how, for example, Hayek's warning of people who are against Nazism sincerely might end up actually backing up the same tyrannies. Okay, I hope it's sort of clear. I will go to the next topic. The next one will be a little bit shorter, I hope. So, okay, phallogocentrism, misogyny, and machismo. Very quickly, what is phallogocentrism, in case some people don't know? This is a term first developed by Derrida, I think, and is how, very loosely, how language favors like the male in the creation of meaning. Okay, so a crucial part here is, yes, we have established how neoliberal policies, global capitalism, in the case of the maquiladoras in Santa Teresa, what's their role in this horrible violence of hundreds of women murdered? But that's not the only explanation. That can't be the only explanation, because if we were talking solely about sacrificial, let's say, vulnerable people for the machinery of progress, we could find this violence expressed in other ways, and not solely or concentrated, especially on women, because in Ciudad Juárez, 4 of every 10 murders were women, and at the same time in the rest of Mexico, only 1 in every 10 murders was women. So we have to look also at specifically male violence. I have here some quotes by feminists, so that took upon this challenge, sort of, they were at the forefront of this challenge. Kate Millett said, control in patriarchal society would be imperfect, even inoperable, unless it had the rule of force to rely upon. Most of the cases in 2,666 and in Ciudad Juárez as well were not only murdered, but they were also raped. And so Susan Brown Miller said, rape is a conscious process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in a state of fear. Radford and Russell, who wrote the first, they compiled the first book exclusively on the topic of femicide, and actually femicide was coined in that book. They say femicide serves as a means of controlling women as a sex class, and as such, it is central to the maintenance of the patriarchal status quo. In real life, Sergio González Rodriguez speaks with one of the heads of the police in Ciudad Juárez, and this man tries to calm him down by telling him, well, in reality, the vast majority of these murders are not committed by like sexual psychotic killers. Most of them are situational murders. That's how he termed it. And so this is supposed to be calming. What's the word? Relieving. This is supposed to relieve him and society at large. Like, oh, I'm glad that we don't have like a pack of serial killers. It's just situational murders. And so these mean situational means that is crimes of passion, crimes in the family or in marriage or in couples, or like, let's say, accidental or collateral killings. But obviously this shouldn't be relieving. We should ask ourselves, well, what about all of these murders that are not by crazy killers? Why is this happening, and why is it just considered normal? In 2666, there's a telling of 106 victims that are found, 6 women that are found killed. And out of this, 19 are killed by their partners or male family members. And of the rest, we can't really tell because 89 are not even solved and 36 are not even identified. But we know from reality, sadly, that this, if they were to be solved, this number would be much higher. Give me a second to see my notes. So, another issue that has to be addressed is, and that renders this enigma clearer and is portrayed thoroughly in the book and actually binds the book together too, is the issue of masculinity, of male violence, of the relational and agonistic nature of virility. And here I bring Pierre Bourdieu into the mix. He wrote a book called about this subject specifically, and he argued that all manifestations of virility possess a fundamental heteronomy, an inherent dependence on the judgment of the male group. So basically what this means is that masculinity is not a positive category, is not something that is defined by itself. It's something that is necessarily defined in contrast to other men. So this renders it an agonistic category that has to be constantly proven, is constantly threatened, and this is why men have to assert virility in every chance they get. The manifestations of virility, whether legitimate or illegitimate, pose an indirect challenge to the masculinity of other men. Therefore, every assertion of virility contains the principle of the agonistic vision. Okay, I already said that. So, I don't have as many examples on the screen as with others, but I'm gonna just give some to you. So, for example, one of the characteristics of Bolaño's work in general is how most men in his works are hypersexual. So this is either in regards to just their sexual prowess or to their genitalia. They are either, if someone has read the Savage Detectives, you know this, but it's really in all his books. They are either like super males that are able to have sex for hours and hours and hours, or they are famous for the size of their penis. And here in 2666 is one of the most blatant or iconic, I don't know how to put it, examples of this, embodied in the character of Entrescu, Nazi general from Romania. And this excerpt of the book is very interesting for this topic at hand. We are with Arcimboldi when he's a young soldier, and he's called to attend almost like a waiter to an officer from the SS, from the Gestapo. And among these people is Entrescu, and is also a baroness, who is exceedingly beautiful, apparently. And so these young cadets, they are curious about finding her room and see if they can actually peep and see her. And so they get into a hidden set of corridors in the castle where they are, looking for her room, and they do find the room. But in the room, to their surprise, they find the Baroness with Entrescu. And what they see is that he said, the book says this, he looked more like a horse than a man, given that Entrescu had nearly a foot-long penis, and moreover, he had the stamina of a horse too, since the Romanian general was tireless. But what makes this episode most disturbing is that they see them having sex, and the sex is very violent. They even say that she has to bite her hand, and she bites her hand so hard that she starts bleeding from the hand, and then she smears the blood on his face, and they start masturbating to what they're seeing. And what is interesting here is that when they enter these corridors, one of them notices there's no rats. And they say this over and over as they're walking the corridors, there's no rats. And the corridors are said to be like a labyrinth. They get lost many times. And so when they're masturbating, Arcimboldi hears the sound of one of his mates climaxing, and he says it sounds like a baby rat. And so the interesting thing here is that it almost puts them or portrays them as rats in a maze, as rats performing an experiment in a maze. And the interesting thing when we look at it this way is that we as readers are also implicated. They are not the only voyeurs that are watching this sex scene, but we as readers are put also in the roles of voyeurs. We also have been through this labyrinth. We, especially the male readers, we are rats ourselves, putting sort of to test how notion of masculinity. I hope everyone's following me. I hope I'm clear enough. And so this all comes together in the way men assert themselves and consider women sort of an extension of the way in which they can assert their masculinity. And violence against women exercised by men is ubiquitous on the novel. I have here several examples. And also another important part is that is very normal, is very normalized. In many instances, it's not even noticed. I'm not going to read this. You can read them on page. Okay, and finally, to call back the previous chapter about sacrifice. In her book, Beyond God the Father, Mary Daly states that society has always had a need to create another, an object that they can condemn, or that we as a society can condemn, so that we can judge ourselves to be good. And both she, Mary Daly, and also Jane Caputi say the prostitute or the whore remains phallocracy's archetypal victim or scapegoat, the man-made bad girl. There are 9 victims in the book who are prostitutes, so their 4 victims are presumed to be prostitutes without any evidence whatsoever, and 2 more are said to have led a double life, also with very flimsy evidence. So this, we know, has always been used and is still used by authorities and by people in general to sort of diminish the horror of femicide. And in many cases, the victim is blamed by how she was dressed, how she led her life, what was her profession. So the bottom line is they deserve to be, and this is from the book, I'm not saying, they deserve to be fucked as many times as anyone wanted to fuck them, but they didn't deserve to die, is what an inmate tells one of the characters in the novel. And also, even the very cosmopolitan, apparently good-spirited critics in the first part of the novel, they do the same things. Manuel Espinosa, one of the characters in the first part of the novel, he scorns his friend Pelletier for getting emotionally involved with a prostitute, and he declares whores are there to be fucked. Okay, so finally we arrived at the Bachelor Machines. From what I've said up till now, you could argue that these are 2 very distinct readings of the novel. You could say that one is a feminist reading of the novel, and the other one is sort of a Marxist reading of the novel, and that they only intersect, but they are not truly articulated. However, and this is where the Bachelor Machines come into play, Bolaño himself argued in notes left in his notebooks where he was working on the novel that there was a hidden center to the novel, but he didn't tell anyone what this hidden center was, and so obviously a parade of scholars have tried to guess, me included. Here you see a little illustration of Bolaño himself of the structure he saw in his novel, like a hidden center. And this would also help explain the title of the book, because the title of the book is very mysterious. It's 2666 is a number that is never, not once said in the full novel, and it never clarifies why is 2666. Ignacio Echeverria, a friend of Bolaño and a critic, speculated about this, and he thought that the center was Santa Teresa, the city of the murders, where all the characters appear at some point in the book. However, I want to advance my own hypothesis, which is the machine célibataire, or Bachelor Machines. So I'm going to read this excerpt of the book. It appears on the first chapter, the chapter about the critics. It says, thousands, hundreds of thousands of machine célibataires crossing an amniotic sea each day on Alitalia, eating spaghetti al pomodoro and drinking Chianti or grappa, their eyes half closed, positive that the paradise of retirees isn't in Italy, therefore anywhere in Europe. Bachelors flying to the hectic airports of Africa, of America, burial ground of elephants, the great cemeteries at light speed. I don't know why I'm thinking this, thought Pelletier. Spots on the wall and spots on the skin, thought Pelletier, looking at his hands. Fuck the sir. Okay. So, this called my attention when I was rereading the book for the thesis. When I was rereading the thesis, the book, I was looking for everything I thought might be meaningful. And with this, I think I struck gold, because I found it, I looked it up online, and it led me on this huge rabbit hole. And suddenly, like, all the pieces fit in my mind, and I hope I can convey why to you. Machine célibataire is a term that was coined by Michel Carouche, a critic, a French writer and critic. He coined it based mainly on Marcel Duchamp's plastic work called Les Grands Verres, or the big glass, which you can see is this image that we have here next to the excerpt of the book. So this work by Marcel Duchamp, he left it unfinished, officially unfinished, in 1923, and it is very, very influential. I didn't know until I found this. So what it represents, the original, the full title is La mariée. Let me see so I can say yes. La mariée mise à nu par ses célibataires, même, or the bride stripped bare by her bachelors, even. So this title indicates that the figurations we see in the work, or at least some of them, have to be humans. And so on the top layer, Duchamp wrote, the top layer is the realm of the bride, the realm of then the woman. And she is the one that produces what he called love gasoline. This love gasoline is what makes the machine move. The bottom half of the glass is the realm of the bachelors. It's important to note that the bachelors are not actual, you don't see men, they're only outfits, and they are outfits from different, he called it the Malic molds, and he called this region the cemetery of liveries. And so they lack life energy, and they have to extract it from the bride. But we know from the title that through the movement of this machine, they are actually killing the bride. So the sharp division of the work into panels demonstrates that a real coupling is never to be attained. As Duchamp clarifies in his notes, speaking of the Malic modes, they will never be able to pass beyond the mask. They would have been as if enveloped, alongside their regrets, by a mirror reflecting back to them their own complexity, to the point of their being hallucinated rather onanistically. So what this all says is that the union, their union, is impossible. And so they are closed, they are enclosed and condemned to be always in this self-destructive loop. And that's why it is onanistically, because it's moved by desire, but it's a desire that is never fulfilled by an actual encounter, rather just by the closest thing available. And so this is precisely why this work by Duchamp has been analyzed using the philosophy of Lacan. Michel Carrouche writes, death also reigns over the male bachelor zone. It will not now be difficult to understand the sexual origin of the large glass mechanics and their signification of death. The theme attributed here to Duchamp's work, all too often noted in literal meaning of the French colloquial expression for orgasm, petite mort, the equation of sex and death. So, yes. Okay, so here we arrive at the death drive. So very quickly, the death drive was first developed as a concept by Freud. So Freud first spoke about the life drive, or the life instinct. The course taken by mental events is automatically regulated by the pleasure principle, which is associated with an avoidance of pleasure or a production of pleasure. So this is a drive that is supposed to secure the maintenance of life. However, he observed several different examples of things that violated this principle, the pleasure principle. For example, he, in his research, encountered people who had traumatic experiences in World War and who maniacally repeated those traumatic experiences in reenactments or in imaginings or in their dreams. And so he asked himself, why do they do that? What is the purpose of this, and how does it fit into the logic of my research? So he, in an effort to explain this phenomena, Freud elaborated a hypothesis of an impulse that would be more primitive and more elementary than the pleasure principle, which overrides the pleasure principle. So he called it the death drive. It's an urge inherent in organic life to restore an earlier state of things, a force whose function is to assure that the organism shall follow its own path to death. Still okay? Okay. So he later discovered that there were in masochism, when studying masochism, that this in masochism, the death drive has a significance of an erotic component. Even the subject's destruction of himself cannot take place without libidinal satisfaction. And now, in Lacan's reinterpretation of Freud's work, he solved sort of the theoretical problems that Freud's formulation offered by saying that actually all drives are a death drive. And the way, this is very complicated, not even I myself understand it fully, so I'm gonna try to explain it very simply. So he said the signifier as such, whose first purpose is to bar the subject, has brought into him the meaning of death. The letter kills, but we learn this from the letter itself. This is why every drive is virtually a death drive. So the signifier or the symbolic language separates us from reality. And the only nodal point at which reality, sexual reality, encounters the symbolic is through desire. But desire is always necessarily unfulfilled. We are never able to experience the real unmediated. And so desire can never be fulfilled, and this creates a trauma because we're never able to attain what we truly desire. And it's because of this trauma that we engage in repeating the same logic over and over, a loop as the Bachelor machine portrays. And so even though desire can never be fulfilled, the drives can be fulfilled because they are merely a representation of that which is desired. I hope this is somewhat clear. Now, why is this important? I will give an example from the book in hopes that this clears things up. In the first chapter, the part about the critics, one of the main plot lines is the love relationship between the critics. So there's Pelletier, a French man, Espinosa, a Spanish man, and Norton, an English woman. So they develop sort of a three-way relationship, and they are constantly, the possibility of a ménage à trois constantly haunts them. And there's a moment in the book where they are riding on a taxi in London, and they are talking about this, and the driver is a Pakistani driver, and he overhears them, and he just bursts out, and he starts telling them that this is very immoral, that where he comes from, she would be called a slut, a whore, a pig. And so they get very angry, they ask him to pull over, and instead of just going away, they pull him out of the cab, Pelletier and Espinosa, and they start beating him to a pulp. He's left almost dying, and they say that when they finish hitting him almost to death, they feel like they finally had the ménage à trois that they were always speculating about. They all feel like if they had experienced a very intense orgasm. So here we see an example of how very literally the death drive functions as a way of not fulfilling desire, obviously, but precisely because desire cannot be fulfilled, it is expressed in the death drive. This is also related at large to the novel, because very quickly Freud in Civilization and its Discontents, where he speaks about World War I, he's trying to posit that a portion of the death drive is diverted towards the external world and comes to light in an instinct of aggressiveness. And he reasons that this is the greatest impediment to civilization. So he already saw, after a few years of developing the death drive, how this was central to violence in, let's say, chaos or self-destruction in the social body. And then, I think we're already approaching the end. I hope I'm not losing anyone. 2666, I argue, itself is a bachelor machine. And this is exemplified, for example, in how most of its main characters are bachelors, and their solitude, their incapacity to truly relate to one another is central to the book. Jolted every so often by brief, powerful electric charges. This is at the very first couple pages in the book, and it's already telling us. Young German girls who dated the occupying forces, but whose desire was really the mask of something else, a theater of innocence, a frozen slaughterhouse. Archimboldi and Ingeborg, who have made love in all possible ways and tried to theorize about new ways, but can come up only with death. The coffee shop where the police officers tell their misogynist jokes looks like a coffin. The macabre story about a soldier who trapped beneath the pile of bodies dug a little cave with his regulation shovel, and to pass the time he jerked off. There are thousands of examples. Also, a police officer that is always unable to feel fulfilled in a relationship he has with a psychiatrist. I don't know, thousands. If you have read the book, you know this, and if not, you should read the book because it's excellent. Finally, why 2666? So here's where it all comes together. 2000 is obviously the number of the new millennium. It is a number that by the time Bolaño was writing his novel, and still today, because we're in the beginning of this millennium, symbolizes the future, the highest form of technology, industrialization, globalization, but it's accompanied by 666, which is obviously the number of the beast, but moreover, it's a very ancient number. It's let's say its semiotic charge comes from old times, and so it's an encounter of the themes of the book, which are progress, embodied or represented by 2000, and in general, violence, here represented in one part of the book by femicide, and in another part of the book by the Holocaust. And this is a connection that has not only been made by Bolaño, obviously. So, for example, Marcel McLuhan in 1951, he wrote The Mechanical Bride, a book of short essays based on Duchamp's work too. which talks about the merger of sexuality, machines, and death. He says, sex has been exaggerated by getting hooked to the mechanisms of the market and the impersonal techniques of industrial production, and argues that for those whom the sex act has come to seem mechanical and merely the meeting and manipulation of body parts, there often remains a hunger which can be called metaphysical, but which is not recognized as such, and which seeks satisfaction in physical danger, or sometimes in torture, suicide, or murder. Jane Caputi, a feminist writer who I also mentioned before, yes, she wrote a book about sexual killers, and she says that she identifies the beginning of the sexual murder age in Jack the Ripper. She sees how it coincides with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and she thinks it's not a coincidence. And finally, George Steiner, in his book of essays called In Bluebeard's Castle, he talks about the Holocaust, and he says, we had turned professional, essentially limited warfare into massacre. And to this question we could, Steiner answers, it was a matter of automatism. Once the elaborate machinery of conscription, transport, and manufacture had slipped into gear, it became exceedingly difficult to stop. So the age of sex crime, the age of machines, the age of mass production, and the age of mass murder all coming together. Machines plus sex plus death. It is no coincidence that in search for a compound term to name the unnameable in Ciudad Juárez, Sergio González Rodriguez opted for the term the femicide machine. Ancient Evil and the Modern World, 2666. So Santa Teresa and Ciudad Juárez are the hellish scenery where our past and future miseries collide. And that's it. I'm going to leave it here because the time is up. I'm just going to leave this part about the reader there in case someone wants to ask something else. And I'm going to leave the stage. I don't know if you have to say something. Thank you.
Now it's actually...
you want to take the...
No, it's okay. Now it's actually just time for questions. And we already have a question for you from Oscar.
Okay.
So he asks, Jorge, what's your take on using semiotic theories, for example, Kristeva's intertextuality, as a ground for social critique? Is this side of semiotics still important nowadays?
Yes. Okay. Yes, it was very important for me, and actually that was the beginning of my work. At the beginning, I only had Kristeva and Bolaño, and the reason I chose Kristeva since the very beginning was mainly because of my advisor, and at that time my professor, Tyler Bennett. He brought Kristeva to us in one of the courses, and I read this essay, War Dialogue Novel. And the thing that I like the most about her is precisely the politically subversive nature of her theory, and how for her, not only let's say literary criticism or semiotics applied to literary criticism, but semiotics at large, it's necessarily transgressive enterprise, let's say, endeavor. Yes, for me, so it was very important, and it's still probably the thing that attracts me the most. I have always been interested in literature, but I have always been interested too in how literature can be an agent, if not of change at large in society, at least an agent of change in the individual, how it can threaten your boundaries, how it can challenge your views, how it can make you question things. And the second part of your question, yes, I think it's extremely important. And I think luckily, actually, since this all of these talks were about Latin America semiotics, I think fortunately in Latin America, semiotics has managed to maintain some of this critical power.
Thank you. So do we have questions from the audience here, or from people in the big blue button?
There's this mysterious figure in the book, an author whose identity, at least in the first chapter, is the major issue. These critics that Jorge was talking about, searching for Archibaldi, or they're searching for his biography, they want details. Maybe you could both summarize this question, or summarize who Archibaldi is, and then maybe say something about how the Bachelor Machine model might address this, or how does it give you an answer to
Okay. So if I understood correctly, yes, in the beginning of the book there are two main questions, which are who is committing these murders and who is Archibaldi. And so, like I said, both are related with authorship. The issue with Archibaldi is that he is an obscure writer. He is maybe something kind of like Thomas Pynchon. Nobody has ever seen him, apparently. Nobody has pictures of him. He never attends any public event. And so that's part of the fascination he exerts upon the critics. And we only meet him in the last chapter of the book. And actually, his name is not even Archibaldi, it's Hans Reiter. He changes his name in the middle of his life. And interestingly, the Bachelor Machine logic also applies to him very prominently, and this reading kind of changes his status in the novel, because in the novel he appears kind of like a 19th century novel hero. You meet him before even he's born, and then you follow him all through his life, and really you root for him. He appears even to be like a stand-up man. He appears to love Ingeborg, his partner. Yes, he is forced to participate in the Second World War as a German soldier, but he repents, and then he becomes unequivocally against Nazism. However, there's indications in the book, if you read closely, that he not only he also obeys the Bachelor Machine logic, because that's important. All men, and that's part of what the book is advancing, all men, we obey the Bachelor Machine logic. I mean, we're all obviously it's related to patriarchy, but he is even hinted in the book that he might have killed Ingeborg, his lifelong partner. In the last portion of the book, he and Ingeborg, they go on vacation, and she is very sick, and they are staying in a farm, and a guy, the guy who's hosting them, he lives alone, and it's rumored that he killed his wife. And later on, he accepts that he killed his wife. He confesses to Archibaldi, and he tells him he killed his wife, and he didn't know why. He just pushed her from a cliff into the sea, and then he went on to live the rest of his life alone, as it should be. That's the way he said. And later, we just hear that Ingeborg has died, but we never see the scene of how she dies. We knew that she was sick, so we assume that's the case. But we hear from other people that actually she apparently fell to the sea and drowned, and her body was never found. And the rest of his life, Archibaldi goes on to live alone, as it should be. And so it's obviously ambiguous. I think Bolaño wanted it to be ambiguous.
There's responsibility, if I may chime in again, there's responsibility of of the Archimbodi or Hans Rater in possibly killing his wife connects also to your observation that the book itself is a bachelor machine. I think I want to get your take on this. Some have accused Bolaño of being a misogynist himself, and in his books we notice that they are gratuitously sexual and violent. All of his books, Savage Detectives in 2666 especially, there's a lot of sex and a lot of violence, and they're real page turners for this reason, and that's part of why they sell.
Yes.
Especially Savage Detectives.
Yes.
And so one can explain this in terms of theory, or one can say that he was selling out or trying to get more book sales. And so, what is the purpose of the book? Is it?
Yes. So this is very interesting. I'm glad that you clarified, because I hadn't understood your question maybe. But yes, this is very important. How the apparent signaling of Archimboldi as probably responsible in the death of his wife kind of reverts and puts the focus on Bolaño himself and his endeavor, as he was also a writer. And like you mentioned, all of his books feature violence, all of his books feature sex. His highest selling book is the Savage Detectives, and that's the one with the most sex. And so this is obviously part of the attraction. But what I think 2666 does, and this is one of the great things of reading it through the lens of Kristeva, for example, or Umberto Eco also talks about this, is how the book, because of its topic, because of how it's written, problematizes all the instances of sex and violence. And so even if Bolaño himself ascribed unconsciously to some of these, even if he enjoyed some of these, or he knew his readers would enjoy it, the book is a complex artifact that criticizes itself and problematizes these instances of machismo, and which is why it's so important. Intertextuality is so important in it. Is that?
I have a question that I am dying to ask.
Okay.
So we know that Bolaño actually met Kristeva and that he was in Paris.
Yes.
So to which extent is an intersection? So if the book lends itself to an intersectional reading, to which extent it was intended so in that way? And how do you know how familiar Bolaño was with not only with Kristeva but actually with the whole Telquel?
Yes, this is a great question. So Bolaño, in one of his short stories that was published posthumously, I don't remember the name of the short story, Labyrinth. The whole story is about the Telquel group to which Kristeva belonged, and Kristeva is actually a character in this short story. However, the extent to which he was very familiar with their work is not clear to me. I know, for example, because he writes about him, that he loved Barthes. He never mentions, even though Derrida wasn't really a part of Telquel, but he was also kind of part of this post-structuralism. He never mentions Derrida. He does mention Lacan. He never mentions Kristeva outside of this short story that I'm aware of. And actually, this is a good point before retiring, that I brought like 50 kilos of books that I never show. So this is all that I read just related exclusively to Bolaño. And so I haven't read like the latest, but really, if he had written about the philosophy of Kristeva, I would know. But I think this at least proves that he was familiar with, and if he liked Barthes, I think he also was aware of this. So I think theory absolutely informed his writing. I have no doubt about it.
So we have another question. So from Christine. as follow-up to the two questions from Tyler, yeah, it was Tyler, given the conclusion you reach, the thesis argument that you make about the continuous unfulfillment of the Bachelor machine, the ongoing lack failure of fulfillment, which is present everywhere, would you also conclude that strange and definable while the structure of the book is necessary, 5 novels or multiple stories, is necessary?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the structure of the book is what the structure of the book is kind of like a test. I think there's a possibility that you would read it, enjoy it, be puzzled by it, and sort of leave it aside, just accepting to be puzzled by it. But then there's also the possibility that you are going to be so this overwhelming amount of detail, because that's one thing of Bolaño. He presents reality in excessive, almost excessive detail. He digresses so much. He gives so much detail in the digressions too, that at some point, if you have a 1,121 page novel, you have to wonder why. What does it all mean? What are and also this structure of the novel and this abundance of the novel, I think, are a way of mirroring reality. So how in reality we perceive stuff as an overabundance of detail, and only afterwards we are able to trace meaning. But he doesn't do that work for us. Yes, that's my answer.
More questions from people online.
Closing words on the series from the host.
You wanna?
Well, I guess
it's your turn.
Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for listening to my presentation. It was very long, so thank you for bearing with me. And now I'm going to give the stage again to Israel, the host, who will close. Thank you, and bye.
Okay, so well, this has been a very, very nice series, and we are very happy that I noticed some recurring names along the whole series. So it's nice that you have been following us, and yeah, so I'm sorry, because I am still thinking about Jorge's presentation because I think it was a very, very nice way to close this series, and I actually still have some questions I want to ask him, but I am not exactly sure of how to formulate them, because I think that what he pointed out, and well, what also Oscar asked, I think that is some like a very important factor tying everything together, because on the one hand, it kind of speaks about some sort of hidden and very important relationality that I mean, in a way, this transgressive approach that is embedded in Kristeva's semiotics, and the way it can be shown to be there in in Bolaño's writing in some way, and the connection with both Barthes and Lotman, it just makes me think about I really don't know how to formulate it, but it's like some very so how to say it? Well, no, but we will keep with English, and yeah, what I was aiming to say is that perhaps simply, so just to put it in a more simpler way, I think it is very nice to remember and to remember, especially between us, that there is some in Kristeva and Lotman, of course, and I am mostly left wondering about the connections that could maybe or maybe not be established between Tartu Moscow school developments and the way semiotics have developed in Latin America. And of course, there are some Latin American scholars who have used Lotman in very critical ways, sometimes relating it to discourse analysis and some other approaches. But well, in any case, I think this was truly a marvelous way to close with this series. And well, I know that we had announced that we were going to have some roundtable, but we decided to cancel it, mainly because there were some issues. But we want to. So even if she's not here, we want to congratulate Dr. Leticia Vitral, because that she will be very happy when she finds out. But yeah, so thank you very much for being here again, and we will see you next semester. And yes, so thank you, and go.
Merry Christmas.
And Merry Christmas. How indeed. So the first, yeah, to organizers include Merit and Tyler and Oscar and me, and of course the presenters were also helping us with the organization. So Carlos and Jorge and Leticia, of course, and yeah, so we couldn't have made this by ourselves. So yes, and of course we couldn't have made it without you. So thank you, and see you next semester.